Earlier this month, Bryan Kohberger, the man accused of the November 2022 murders of 4 University of Idaho students, unexpectedly pleaded guilty to all charges. At a July 2nd change of plea hearing, he admitted to the first-degree murders of Kaylee Goncalvez, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, as well as a related burglary charge. This plea was part of an agreement that spared him the death penalty, instead guaranteeing life imprisonment. Following Kohberger's confession, the judge lifted a months-long gag order that had barred investigators and attorneys from discussing the high-profile case. Law enforcement, now free to speak publicly, emphasized that their focus had always been on securing justice for the victims and bringing closure to the community. Judge Stephen Hippler, who presided over the case, agreed to end the gag order on July 17th, noting that with Kohberger's guilty pleas, concerns about prejudicing a jury were moot. The judge clarified that sealed case documents would be reviewed and unsealed in batches, not all at once. Within days, authorities began releasing investigative records that had been kept under wraps throughout the proceedings. Kohberger's sentencing hearing was held on July 23, 2025 in a Boise courtroom, after a venue change due to the intense publicity. There, Judge Hippler formally sentenced the 30-year-old former criminology PhD student to 4 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, plus, of course, an additional 10 years for burglary. This fulfilled the plea deal's terms and ensured that Bryan Kohberger would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In court, Kohberger declined to speak when given a final opportunity, simply saying, "I respectfully decline." He offered no apology or explanation, sitting impassively in an orange jumpsuit as victims' families confronted him. The judge condemned Kohberger as a faceless coward and remarked on his lack of remorse. Judge Hippler reflected that the crimes were unfathomable and senseless, the greatest tragedy for the families, and acknowledged that we may never know why Kohberger committed such evil acts. He cautioned that dwelling on Kohberger's motive only gives the killer the spotlight, attention, and power he appears to crave. The heart of the sentencing hearing was the victim impact statements, which lasted several hours. Family members and the 2 surviving roommates delivered powerful emotional testimonies about the 4 young lives that were cut short. For the first time publicly, one surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen, spoke about the trauma and the survivor's guilt that she has endured, describing how she now suffers panic attacks and must check her room each night out of fear. The other surviving roommate, Bethany Funk, had a friend read her statement, recalling the horror of discovering the crime scene and the lasting pain it caused. Parents and siblings of the victims addressed Kohberger directly, expressing their grief and anger. Kaylee Goncalvez's father, for example, called Kohberger a complete joke and emphasized that throughout the media frenzy, the families worked to keep the focus on the victims rather than the killer. Mr. Goncalvez underscored that the 4 friends will be remembered for the joy they brought to the world, stating, "All anyone talked about when they talked about this case was Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan." Other loved ones shared memories. Madison Mogen's stepfather spoke of how this world was a better place with her in it, and her father tearfully recounted her ambitions and the final Father's Day card she gave him. These statements painted a picture of each victim's vibrant life and the devastating void left by their loss. Many family members also thanked law enforcement and prosecutors for ensuring that justice was served, expressing relief that they brought this case to closure. With the gag order lifted and the case concluded, authorities released hundreds of pages of investigative documents, shedding new light on the crime and the painstaking search for the killer. Police reports confirmed the sheer brutality of the murders themselves. Responding officers described a gruesome scene inside the off-campus house. Walls and floors smeared with blood, and some victims so badly wounded that they were initially unrecognizable. Family members later revealed that Kaylee Goncalvez had been stabbed 34 times, and another victim suffered even more wounds. In fact, investigators say Xana Kernodle fought desperately, sustaining over 50 stab wounds, mostly defensive injuries, indicating a fierce struggle before she succumbed to fatal wounds to her lung and heart. Kernodle's boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, was found nearby. The coroner determined that his fatal injury was a deep stab under the clavicle that severed major blood vessels. On the 3rd floor, Maddie Mogen and Kaylee Goncalvez were discovered together in bed. They too had multiple stab wounds to vital organs, and Kaylee had severe damage to her face and signs of possible asphyxiation, suggesting the killer used brutal force. These horrific details, kept sealed during the court case, shed light on the viciousness of the crime and have only deepened the family's sorrow, with Kaylee's family stating the details are more horrific than we can imagine. Despite the wealth of forensic evidence tying Kohberger to the murders, a clear motive remains elusive. In fact, investigators admit they may never know what drove Bryan Kohberger to attack these students. "He's the only one that has the why," said Idaho State Police Lieutenant Darren Gilbertson, adding that any reason Kohberger might give may only make sense to him. From the start of this case, the question of why them has loomed large. Moscow police now say that they found no prior link between Kohberger and the victims. No personal connection or online interactions that would explain why he targeted this particular friend group. "We've looked for a link and we have not found one," an official said, noting that they could not even determine if any one victim was the primary target. They do suspect Kohberger chose the victim's house intentionally, though the exact reason, we don't know, according to Moscow's police chief. The lead prosecutor, Bill Thompson, shared his personal theory that one of the young women on the top floor, either Kaylee or Maddie, was the intended target, simply because Kohberger headed straight to that floor and may not have expected to encounter the others on the second floor. In Thompson's view, it's more likely than not he did not expect to encounter Xana and the others up and about. This theory, however, is not backed by any definitive evidence. It remains completely speculative, and Kohberger himself has provided no insight into his motivations. What the evidence does show is a pattern of planning and predatory behavior in the lead-up to the crime itself. Phone records indicate that Kohberger's cell phone was detected near the victim's residence at least a dozen times in the months before the murders, almost all of the occasions in the late night or early morning hours. Surveillance footage also captured a white Hyundai sedan matching Kohberger's car, making repeated passes by the house at around the time of the murders. In newly unsealed interviews, one surviving roommate told police that about a month before the attack, Kaylee Goncalvez had voiced concerns about a possible stalker. She had seen an unknown man watching her from behind the house when taking her dog out, and she mentioned to friends that she had a stalker who sent her some odd messages. Just 9 days before the murders, the young women returned home to find their front door mysteriously left open and damaged, as if an intruder had tried to force entry. An incident so alarming that they began arming themselves with golf clubs and had the lock fixed the next day. It's unclear if these incidents were related to Bryan Kohberger or merely coincidence, but they showed that the victims felt a growing sense of unease in the weeks before the tragedy. Investigators chased down countless leads of this nature, from reports of a stranger lurking in a neighbor's yard, possibly Kohberger himself, to tips about a man asking for a tactical knife cover at a local store. Ultimately, the break in the case came from solid forensic sleuthing. At the crime scene, police found a knife sheath left on a bed, which contained DNA that did not belong to the victims. By extracting a DNA profile from the sheath and matching it to a sample from Kohberger's family's trash, a discarded Q-tip swab, detectives were able to identify Kohberger as the suspect. Once his name surfaced, investigators rapidly uncovered more evidence pointing to him. He had purchased a military-style knife online. His white Hyundai matched the vehicle seen near the house, and his phone pings aligned with being in the vicinity of the crime scene at the right times. Armed with this evidence, officers arrested Bryan Kohberger at his parents' Pennsylvania home in late December of 2022, about 6 weeks after the murders. At the time of arrest, Kohberger briefly chatted with investigators about some mundane topics before quickly asking for a lawyer when confronted about the Moscow killings. He never confessed or explained himself during those post-arrest interviews. In fact, prosecutors revealed that Kohberger had been in the process of actively deleting things from his devices, apparently trying to erase digital traces that might have linked him to the victims, suggesting that he went to lengths to conceal any motive or planning if it was recorded electronically. Even after pleading guilty, Kohberger refused to elaborate on his actions in court, leaving the burning question of why unanswered. The motive for the killings remains a mystery, one report concluded, echoing the frustration of investigators who exhaustively pieced together the how and the who, but not the why. With Bryan Kohberger now condemned to spend his life in prison, the long, painful saga of the Idaho student murders has come to an end. The lifting of the gag order has allowed authorities and the public to finally acknowledge the full scope of what happened and to speak the victims' names freely. At a national level, there was an outpouring of sympathy. Even the White House weighed in, with the press secretary conveying, "Our nation grieves with you" to the victims' families, and vowing that, "We will never forget the precious souls who were lost in this horrific act of evil." In the courtroom and beyond, those 4 beloved students have been at the center of the story. Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, ages 20 and 21, are remembered as bright, kind, and full of promise by all who knew them. Their families have spoken of birthdays missed, future plans never realized, and the enduring pain of their absence. Yet alongside their grief, there is some solace in knowing that justice has finally been served. Law enforcement officials have expressed hope that the community of Moscow, Idaho can now begin to heal after living in fear and sorrow for so long. The Moscow police chief said that their mission was always to bring justice for the victims, and that mission is now accomplished. The families in their strength have tried to turn this tragedy into a celebration of their missing loved ones' lives, ensuring that the world remembers the victims not for just how they died, but for how they lived and loved. Kohberger's conviction and life sentence can never bring those 4 young lives back, but it guarantees that he will never harm anyone again. After 3 long years, the quest for answers and accountability has ended, and this story has finally been resolved.